Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Okay.
Good evening.
Yeah, thank you to all. Good evening to all, and thank you to be with us tonight. So I am Marie-Pierre Ballarin, a researcher in history of Africa at the Institute of Research for Development and specialist of East Africa and the Western Indian Ocean. Since 2017, I am coordinating the project SLAVENet, Slavery in Africa, a dialogue between Europe and Africa, that has for main goal to establish a scientific network of several institutions and research groups from Europe and Africa in the field of slavery studies. But one of our main objectives is also to think together on the legacies of slavery and slave trade in our society. And since the 8th May, and thanks to the initiative of Arcita Waters, Director of Cultural Affairs at the Alliance Française in Nairobi, you have been able to watch the 4th episode of the documentary Slavery Roots, which traces the history of slavery since the medieval period. So we are reunited today for our second online discussion around the two last parts of this documentary. But first, we will show you the trailer of the documentary, and then after that I will be able to continue and launch the discussion online. So thanks to Arcita and Sabrine, and so we meet in a few minutes.
Slavery is basically the use of violence to coerce people to work, to produce commodities for the world market.
If you want to understand the enormity of some of these events, it's not enough just to judge them in terms of current values. You've got to get inside what they were thinking at the time.
Il y a cette contradiction qui est là, au fondement, je pense, de l'esclavage, qui fait que les maîtres qui vivent avec eux, ils savent très bien que ce sont des êtres humains. Et je pense que c'est une des raisons qui parfois aussi explique qu'on va manifester sa puissance par la violence et le mépris.
At the extremes of human domination, even in slavery, we find there is always resistance, there is always tension, and there's always struggle. I don't think it's possible to fully dehumanize another person. And that's mostly because I think that humanity has boundless limits.
Thank you very much. I wish also to thank all the people. Without them, this event would not have taken place. So, merci Sabrine Tedeschi, Boldrine Mbale, David Amolo, who worked hard with Arcita to organize this online discussion. I also want to thank Cédric Torisson, the director of the Alliance Française, and also Alice Fardel and the Compagnie des Phares et Balises, producer of the documentary, which graciously authorized these screenings. Without them, this event would not have taken place. So tonight we have the privilege of welcoming Juan Gelas, who is one of the film directors and who has been instrumental in making this event possible too. We have the chance to welcome Professor Catherine Kokry-Vidrovich, who is specialist on African history and Professor Emeritus at the University Paris Diderot. She has been the historical advisor of the documentary. Professor Tube, who is the Vice Chancellor of the University Cheikh Anta Diop in Dakar, and had to deal with the last minute unforeseen issue and regrets that he cannot be with us. But I want to thank him also because he was supposed to be part of this discussion. And he founded the Centre africain de recherche sur les traites et les esclavages that he continues to lead and train many young African historians. We have also with us Professor Samuel Nyanshoga, who is teaching history and is also the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the Catholic University of Eastern Africa. Between 2009 and 2012, he led the program dedicated to the legacy of slavery on the Kenyan coast, in which Patrick Abungu and myself, we contributed. Then I want also to welcome Mr. Patrick Abungu, who is a museologist working at the National Museum of Kenya as a senior curator. In 2014, he established the first museum dedicated to the history of slavery and slave trade on the Kenyan coast in Shimoni, and today is curator of the Slavery Museum and Slave Heritage Site. Firstly, I'm going to give them the floor so that they can share their experience and help us to reflect on the question which are at the heart of this debate. Then, with the help of Arcita and Sabrine, I will communicate to them the questions that came up following these projections, and I am sure that they will do their best to answer. So, dear one, I hope that you are well today. Why it is important for you to tell the history of slavery today?
Well, hello everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, I guess there are many ways to answer this question, but I think what we wanted to do was, by making this series, was to say that this history, this long, century-long history, is not it's not just a history of the past. That the idea that this somehow is over and we have to turn the page and move on, it's simplistic and doesn't quite describe the situation today. I think also too often this history, when it's taught, we probably will speak about that later on in the discussion, in curriculums, for example, if it's taught, it's often looked through a national prism. And we think that it's important to look at it as a global history that somehow helps to understand the dynamics of the world today. Yeah, I think, you know, this is a 14th, 13th century long history that has totally created new spaces, like in the Caribbean, for example, or in Brazil, although people were in Brazil before the slave trade came and the slave came in, but a totally new country appeared out of this system. So I think it's created spaces, it's created interaction between spaces in the world. And I think in order to understand what links us, we have to kind of look back at the history.
Many thanks, Juan, for your contribution. Dear Catherine, it is for you to tell us why it is so important to tell this story today.
Well, I am both a researcher and a teacher, and I realized, well, when the studies about slavery, the slave trade began to be really known, that it was a part of the world history completely, and that African slavery and African slave trade and slavery, like all in other parts of the world, are extremely old. We know it better when it focused on North Africa and just through the Sahara and on the Indian Ocean because of the invasion of the Muslims. But it was much before, as you saw in the other movies last week. But this is especially readable when we speak of the Atlantic, so-called Atlantic slave trade, which involved much more than the Atlantic. From that time, it involved the whole world, in fact, as it had been involved before, and it became more and more important to explain the history of the rest of the world. And especially, of course, if we focus on the Atlantic slave world, the history of Europe and the emergence of capitalist system in Europe. It cannot be understood without the very important role that the slave trade played to accumulate wealthness from the 15th century till the end of the 19th century for the industrial world everywhere in the world. Therefore, history of slavery, and specifically for this period from the 15th century of South African slave trade, Africa Sahara slave trade, is absolutely necessary to understand how the history of the world. And this was not done at all. And I think it is extremely important that it has to be studied more and more to understand the rest of world history.
Okay. Thank you very much, Catherine. And it is really true because, and especially for tonight, because we have the Atlantic side of the world and also the East African coast with us, I should say. Yes. So please, Professor Samuel Nyanchoga, tell us what is so important today to teach, disseminate this history. We can't hear you. We can't hear you, Samuel. I'm sorry.
You can't hear me?
Now it's better. Thank you very much. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me into this discussion. I know the subject of slavery is a very emotive topic of discussion even today. No, the apologetics of slavery studies might want to argue that there is no need for us to discuss slavery today. But those of us who are in the academia, when we trace the history of the human race, is simply characterized by two processes, one of domination and one of subjugation. The history of human society from slavery to modern capitalism, what are the traces that we are able to see that connect all these histories? In the East African coast, which one may argue that has not been given adequate attention because of the Atlanticization of the slavery studies, what we find are the enormous legacies of slavery. And this is the subject that we want to bring to the focus and discuss it and make humanity understand that the legacies of slavery are with us. It is important for us to implant this history as part of our national history, as part of our academic program, so that you can be able to see how humanity has developed. The subject of slavery is also important to the general public. It's important for us to understand that even when we look at slavery as a topic of heritage and human development, it is important for us to understand the dynamics that underlie that particular form of history. What were the sufferings that people went through? How many people, for example, were enslaved? What impact did this have in terms of the descendants of the former slaves? So this is a subject that is not necessarily a past subject. It's a subject that is very recurrent, and it occurs now and again. So it is important for us to look at this history and try to understand it from the different contexts in which we live today.
Okay, thank you very much. And then it helps me to give the floor to Patrick, who is specialist of heritage. So Patrick, how to you should this history be disseminated? Sorry.
Thank you, Marie-Pierre, and thank you for having me in the forum. Slavery is a very cruel subject. That's one thing that we have to understand, because it comes with connotations of a very extreme violence, stigma, racism, and any other abuses of human rights. At the same time, it produced a lot of wealth and a lot of poverty on different ends of the world. And so not so many people are keen to talk about it, or even to embrace the topic of slavery or the subject of slavery. But if we look at the chronology of events that have been portrayed by the documentaries, and then you reflect on the current situation in the world, then you find that human beings have not learned much from the past, because we still have all those traits, the negative traits that are associated with slavery in our midst, and we see them in our everyday lives. So it is important that we talk about this subject with a view and with a hope that at individual level or societal level, people will embrace it and take what is positive about it and look at how to address all those negative traits that are associated with it, so that we can move on as humanity. But above all, it's very important to address it now. Otherwise, we'll end up passing the same challenges that we're experiencing at the moment to the future generation, just the way we inherited them from those who came before us.
Thank you very much, Patrick. So I have a first question for you all. For you all, and then maybe plus for Samuel and Patrick. So from Dr. Mshai Mwangola is asking, so we have the story of three spaces, Africa, Europe, and the Caribbean, but less the Eastern diaspora. So where did our diaspora go, and what is their story post the first episode? I hope that I am clear. Actually, there are many questions. The one that went east instead of west, so maybe it goes more with the East African coast. The one who went to Middle East and Asia, what about them? And who is doing research on that, and what status is it for them? So maybe, or maybe I can give you the floor to Catherine in general. Where did the diaspora go? Sorry. The diaspora.
For me?
Yeah, maybe first for you, and then after I will pass the floor to our colleagues from Kenya.
The Atlantic slave trade is the last one. Main streams were born toward the Indian Ocean, much earlier than the Atlantic, because the Europeans went to Africa in the 15th century, but the Indian people and Indonesian, etc., were more than 1 millennium BC. Therefore, contacts were extremely important, and probably, we don't know for this all times, and we begin to know with the Arabic and Jewish sources, it was very important. It went on afterwards, of course. It has been less studied, that's true, much less studied, perhaps specifically in Western Europe, because Western Europe was interested with the Atlantic slave trade, and especially in France, where knowledge of the Indian Ocean affairs is relatively recent, very well studied now by scholars, but not before 15-20 years ago at most. And this movie, having been done first for the French public. To my mind, it is true that it has a tendency to focus a little too much on the West instead of the East, which probably was in the long term at least as important as the West slave trade. It's known for the beginning because it has been studied, you have seen last week, from Egypt, and from Egypt to Baghdad, it has been very important. There is no reason to think that it was less afterwards. But we lack studies on the question. We have less study than for the West. And we know also that the slave trade in the Indian Ocean increased enormously in the 19th century because of the general monetarization of the whole, and because of the connection, very important connection in the slave trade for the financing fight between slave traders involved in the Atlantic and slave traders involved in the Indian Ocean through the Mediterranean Sea, through the opening of the Suez Canal at the end of the 19th century. Goods and everything circulated everywhere. And Portuguese too went to the eastern coast to breed slaves, but Indian, Chinese less because they were forbidden to come at that time, but Indian from the east and all along the Persian Gulf, they traded, of course, with Swahili and Arab of the eastern coast, and this begins to be reasonably studied now, but it has been later than it emerged later than for the West. For the West, really, there have been many research since the 2000s, and to the East, it began later, and it may be still rather difficult, as it has been elsewhere, of course, for the Muslim world to involve the important role of Islam there. That means not from Islam, but from the empires of the time who were Muslim, of course, and from the point of view of the traders, were much involved for financing and organizing slave trade in the Indian Ocean. But the role of, in all over the 19th century, the role of financing of the Mediterranean Sea from Italy, from the Western world, was involved too, everywhere in the world. Therefore, there are research to understand why sometimes, well, let us say Black people are less visible, which is not so true, in fact, in the eastern part of the world than in the United States. But in the United States, segregation was so strong that it is more visible. The rules of succession may have a reason to not to eradicate, but to make the differentiations of color less visible in Asia than elsewhere. Well, we have a lot of research to do for that, and East African historians are the best to study it. I am not a specialist, of course. Therefore, it's to you to give your advice.
Okay, thank you very much, Catherine. So it helps me to give the floor to Professor Samuel and Patrick. The question is the one from East Africa went, what about the one that went to Middle East and East and Asia? And actually, who is doing research on this at the moment, currently? Samuel,
Okay.
maybe you want to start?
Okay, thank you very much, Mary. I just want to pick up from where Professor Catherine left. In terms of numbers, it's very contentious, first of all. It's estimated about 8 million, Africans who are exported through the Indian Ocean corridor. And there were two important points of destination. There was the coastal destination, because in the mid of the 17th and 19th century, what we see was the development of a huge commercial empire from northern Mozambique, the coast of Zanzibar, the coast of Kenya, the coast of Somalia, southern part of Somalia, all the way to Ethiopia and Egypt. There were slaves that were mostly used along these areas. So the East African coast was also one of the major destinations of slaves. But if we extend further, we find that slaves were also taken, to the Portuguese colonies in the Americas. Some of them were found in the, in the French colonies in the Indian Ocean, Mauritius, Madagascar, Reunion, Seychelles, among others. Others went to India, and even further to, Arabia, Oman, among other places. And if you look at the history of Asia and the Middle East, one will begin to understand that the African diaspora in the Indian Ocean was very, very significant, because they played a very important role in the development of many kingdoms and empires in Asia. So for that aspect, it's important to understand that these were the most important destination areas: the East African coast, the Middle East, Portuguese colonies, among others. But however, it's important to understand that there is a limitation of accessing resources, because many of the East African scholars have limited access to Arabic sources, because most of the sources are written in Arabic, and that could perhaps explain why there is a slow growth in the development and writing about the history of the East African coast. There are quite a number of scholars who have written on this. Sharif has been one of them. Fair has been another one. Cooper, who are among the earlier scholars. We are also emerging scholars who are moving into area. We have Marie-Pierre, I'm there myself. Patrick, we are some of the emerging scholars who are looking at some of the slavery issues along the East African coast. We also have a number of our graduate students who are now conducting their doctoral studies in this particular area. Perhaps what is important to understand is that the context of slavery within this region must be understood, in terms of the legacies that it has left behind. One of the issues that we are studying here in this region is looking at the slave routes. What is the importance of these slave routes within the region? How do people perceive them? What kind of historical, interpretation has been given to them? In terms of the heritage, what are some of the, heritage sites that remained behind? How does society look at this heritage? Do they look at this, as sites of reluctance? Do they look at this as sites of community empowerment and national development? So there is quite a number of issues that is being done within the region. And I think, as we progress, maybe in the next 5 years, we'll have a repository of a lot of scholarly work that is emerging from the region.
Thank you very much, Samuel. And just before to give you the floor, Patrick, I want to give the other question of Dr. Mshai Mwangola. Is asking, can Professor Nyanchoga and Mr. Abungu please speak to how Kenyan intellectual and cultural institutions are placed and engaging with this research in its research and curriculum? So I think just picking up what you have said, Patrick, Samuel, sorry. So please, Patrick.
Thank you, Marie. I think Professor Catherine and Samuel actually comprehensively looked into this. And as Catherine pointed out, before even the Portuguese reached the East African coast, the Indian traders using monsoon winds had been trading in this region for thousands of years, hundreds of years. And part of the items, the goods that were taken back were slaves, apart from ivory and other goods. I'll just add a little bit on the question of where are they? This is an area that still needs to be worked on comprehensively. But what we know, if you go to India, then there are the cities, the exported communities from East Africa. So the cities are very well known, but there are those ones who are also liberated. They were, during the voyage, they were liberated by the British, rehabilitated and brought back and settled in Kenya, around Mombasa. So we have Rabai, we have Freetown communities. Those ones we know where they are. It's interesting that towards the Arabian countries, sort of all this, the legacies sort of vanish, but not completely, but tracing them, and as Samuel has said, maybe the sources which are in Arabic might be problematic because we need to work on that and we need to translate that. But the closest I've come close to any of these communities is a minority community in Iran. And there are those pointers because intangible cultural heritage and practices are very similar to those ones of the East African coast. So they could be traced. There are those linkages through the pointers. What are the institutions, scholars doing about this? And who is working on what and the status? I think I'll pull that one, the institutions and the scholars. And there are several institutions in Kenya or several colleagues working in the subject of slavery, representing different institutions. And we have Professor Nyanshoga, who's worked a lot with students in this area. We have the National Museums of Kenya, and I'll talk about that comprehensively. We have institutions like Pwani University, their colleagues there, Ali Mwasi, Ahmed Mvita, Dr. Hassan Mwakimako. Those are Pwani University professors. And we have also Mbwarali from Pwani, but they are not working on this area specifically. So we can't say that they are working on the areas of those who are transported or exported to India or Arabia. But they are working on this, but this is an area that really needs to be worked on. In terms of the institutions and how they are placed, I think that one ties with those universities, the institutions of higher learning, in collaboration with external and internal partners, especially the National Museums of Kenya, who are in charge of the heritage resources, the cultural ones, and the heritage resources that are associated with the legacies of slavery actually falls under the National Museums of Kenya. So in terms of protection, conservation, research, documentation, and presentation of the same is done by the National Museums of Kenya, and they have done this. So there are several heritage sites that are gazetted as national monuments. They are relevant information. So this is one area that researchers can access their materials and also works as destination points for schools and higher institutions of learning and the general public. So that in the institutional part of it. But we also have the Kenya National Commission for UNESCO that has brought in different representatives from departments to form the Legacies of Slavery Expert Committee. And the National Museums of Kenya is represented. We have a colleague from Kisii University, Dr. Herman Kiriama, and several key members and key institutions. And the idea is to look at the subject of slavery, which has not been very prominently done in Kenya, and to make it visible And the idea is also to look at the policy issues that will address this subject and fill in the gaps that are currently there. I don't know if there's something that I've missed, but I can always address it when we come back.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I think you had the question allow us to think the history of slavery and its legacies in a holistic manner, and I think it is what we need. So you talked about the dissemination aspect, and so I would like maybe to ask Juan Gelas. We had a seminar in October in Mombasa in For Jesus, which was very interesting in terms of how we can teach this history, how we can tell this history, how we can present this history. And the documentary for this has a big role. So for you, Juan, how could we contribute to make known this history through the audiovisual technicals?
Yeah, again, I think there are many layers to this. An endeavor like the one we did, like a 4 series, an expensive series, because we travel around the world to make it. Took a lot of time. A lot of people worked on it. It's not necessarily the only way to do it, although we're glad that we've done this work. I think there are also other ways to tell the history at a much more local level for the local communities. And that can be quite simple by documenting the living memories of people in certain areas of the world. I think then you go into the level of political will of states to inscribe that in the curriculums of the schools and universities and colleges. And that's out of our reach. We in the media, we can contribute to provide more varied approaches and voices around this subject. But then when you go into the subject of how it's taught in schools, which I think is probably essential, and because not everybody watches television, and not everyone agrees with what's on television, and so it's a complicated business to talk about this in the media, and each country will want to talk about it from their point of view.
Varied approaches and voices around this.
The first time that when we made this series, we proposed a global look at it, which actually is very rare. But I think schools, colleges, universities, it's where it's at. And that without the political will of the governments and of the people involved in education, it's very difficult to progress on this. I'm sure Catherine will have to say something much more about this as the French experience. But if we hadn't have the political will at a certain time 20 years ago that inscribed in the law, we have to teach this history in schools. And it has to be properly inscribed in the curriculum of all students in a thorough way, not just from the French point of view, but in the global, inscribed in the history of the world. Things would have not progressed in France, and the history of the slave trade would be told today like it was told when I was in school a long time ago, which was very basic and didn't give you any understanding of the system. So I think in various countries around the world, it's now also a matter of what I call political will.
Yeah, thank you very much. Do you want to add something, Catherine? And then I have another question. So.
Well, the teaching of everywhere in the world, I think, teaching on slavery at school was very little done for different reasons. In the Caribbean islands, for example, people had been taught that slavery is shameful, and therefore they did not remind it. Well, for the slave traders, of course, the descent did not want to speak of what did their ancestors. And for the African themselves, well, it was very impolite, quite impossible to tell that somebody is a slave, because it was also shameful. Therefore, it was necessary to go above all this prejudice, to impose historically, to teach and to learn and teach and study the history of slavery. This was not easy nowhere, including in Africa, and of course, including France. And it is still now not so easy for a part of, well, let us say, nationalist French people, as you have in all countries, who don't want to speak of something shameful for the history of the past. And this is was generally expanded. And that was our strong struggle since the beginning of this century. What Marie-Pierre is part of it for Eastern Africa, and many others, and Ibrahim Ayoub was extremely important for Western Africa, etc. Before them, you could not speak of slavery because it was shameful, and you don't speak of something shameful. And historians are supposed to be learned people with the less prejudice possible, and to tell the truth, even if this truth is not very pleasant, which is the case more or less everywhere, including inside Africa, where there were slave trade people and enslaved people. Like, therefore, it may be politically difficult for the government and for part of the public opinion. And we historians have really to struggle very hard, and cineasts, and that is the aim of this special movie, which was not at all possible to conceive 10 years ago. And they had to struggle quite a lot to obtain the authorization because the TV heads are afraid of public opinion, and they don't want to offend public opinion. This is true everywhere. And this is one of our struggle when we study the slave trade and slavery, which is so important in the history of humanity. What I can say.
Many thanks. Samuel, you want to add something? We can't hear you.
To hear me?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. I wanted to add from where my colleagues have left, particularly on the subject of teaching slavery studies, in the African context. One of the challenges that we face, particularly in the teaching of slavery studies, is based on how knowledge is produced, particularly in the African political context, and what are our national priorities, for example, whether we are moving towards, the sciences or humanities. And this is one of the issues that national research priorities keep on changing, and therefore they affect the subject of humanities, where actually slavery is anchored. We also found out that how is slavery depicted in our textbooks? This is one of the major issues, again, that we found was a major problem. There is also, problems of methodology. Are we teaching it in a very subjective manner, or are we teaching it very objectively? Sometimes, we might teach this subject of slavery you know, in a very accusatory manner, accusing others to having been the slave masters and others having been the slave victims. And therefore, these are communities now, for example, in the East African coast, who are living side by side, and therefore we're trying to, you know, the resurgence of conflicts that, you know, have been there over the years. There is also the problem of moral issues. Sometimes when you talk to the descendants of the freed slaves, they will want to forget this story. So by teaching this subject, are we going against, you know, against their conscience? There was also the issue of, we have to navigate through also the issues of ideology. Do we teach this as a subject, you know, where we portray others as having been victims and others as having been, you know, villains, or do we teach it as a subject of social tolerance so that people can be able to understand that this is an inhuman experience that occurred in, you know, the stage of human development, and therefore what we need to do is to promote social tolerance, try to memorialize this subject in a manner that, you know, will bring understanding and social cohesion in society. So these are some of the issues that we are dealing with. We are actually developing programs on slavery studies, and we are also making a proposal to the, you know, to the national curriculum development institutions to try and implant this subject as part of our national history across the region. But these are some of the challenges that you know we come across.
Thank you very much. Before I ask another question, I don't know, Patrick, if you want to add on that concerning the situation.
Just to add a little bit, because what Samuel is saying is what should be done before. But currently, the pre-university sort of level of engagement is very minimal. I think slavery is taught in passing as part of the subject of trade. So it's not taught comprehensively in our schools. And if you look over the years, systematically the content has been reduced, and now it's just a very small component. So one wonders, why is that happening? Why slavery studies in our primary schools, in our high schools, being diluted? I'm not willing to speculate on that, but I think that is food for thought for the people who are engaged in this dialogue.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, because sometimes the sound is leaving us. We have another question from our professor from Bath University, Iftikhar Malik. He's asking you, can we call post-abolition indentured labor as a new form of slave trade and slavery? Okay, Catherine, do you want to start?
To my mind, there are forms of kinds of slavery, but to my mind, we have to be exigent to the definition of what we call a slave and slavery. A slave was I should say, a non-person, not individual. He or she existed only because he or she had a master, and the master might do anything with the slave. It depends on the societies. There were societies where you might kill for nearly nothing a slave, other societies where it was forbidden. It depends. But the master was the only will of the, supposed to be, of course he was not, but he or she was the only will understood for the slave. And another characteristic of slaves, but may fit with other cases with indentured labor, is that a slave used to be uprooted because if he or she was not uprooted, well, the possibility of a flight was always very possible. And in many African societies, a slave was not recognized ancestors because he or she had left the ancestors at home and he was abroad, and therefore it was finished. And this was a real problem in the Caribbean islands, where all slaves, of course, were uprooted and had no possible cult with the African ancestors. Therefore, they created a new form of community by voodoo, for example, by religions of the kind. Therefore, but I think a slave really is a slave, and indentured labor is forced labor, and forced labor is not necessarily by a slave, and all slaves were not submitted to forced labor. It is not synonymous. You had in forms of societies, including in Africa, I should say high-standing slaves, slaves of the prince or things of the kind. Therefore, forced labor is really the master uses the labor of the individual. He doesn't use the individual himself or herself. Well, it may look like non-important, in fact, of course, because the compulsion was real, but I think it is not quite, we don't speak quite of the same topic, even if it is very close, of course, and it has to be studied too. But this is my opinion, but...
Okay, thank you very much. Catherine, Samuel, do you want to I can see that you're moving.
Yes, thank you very much. I wanted to make a contribution along the East African coast. We have spent quite some time on research, and I want to begin from the southern part of Somalia. At the time of the Italian occupation, immediately after the abolition of slavery. What happened is that what we now know today as the Bantu Somalia, they do not belong to the mainstream clans of the Somalia community. So their affiliation to these mainstream Somali communities was through a form of contract labor, so that they can be able to gain some form of identity. So during the time of the Italian occupation in the southern part of Somalia, which became some of the most important plantation economy, the Italian actually used what Professor Itifkal is talking about as indentured labor, which was actually contract labor, and both of it and slavery were very servile conditions. If you look at the work of Cooper along the Kenyan coast, what happened immediately after the abolition, they developed what we now know today as the process of the patron clients, where many of the slaves decided to stay with their former slave masters, and therefore those servile conditions continued under what was to be known as the contract labor or indentured labor. If you move to Tanganyika under the German rule, there's quite a lot of work that has been done on, the contestation between abolitionism and emancipation. What happened is that in Tanganyika, emancipation came in without necessarily abolitionism, and many of the people entered into contract labor with most of their plantation economy during the Chairman rule in Tanganyika, and the contract actually lasted for about 7-8 years, and the conditions were almost the same. If you look at the contracting process between the French who were taking slaves from the coast of Mozambique to the Indian Ocean islands, the terminology that was being used was that one of engage. And that is in English. I don't know, the French people will be able to understand it much better. What was happening is that the slave masters were taking the slaves from the interior of Tanganyika to the coast, and therefore handing them to the middlemen. And the slaves who were supposed to agree that they have agreed to the contract of going to work for a number of years. But then most of the slaves were illiterate. They could not understand this, and they had never seen those contracts. So that system continued. So what Iftikhar is talking about, that was actually a trajectory of transiting from slave trade to indentured labor, which during the colonial period was also a subject of civility. Going a little bit further, particularly in Zanzibar in 1907, what we found is that the British subjects were not allowed to engage slaves. They were not allowed to own slaves, but they could engage slaves on a contract basis by taking them from their masters, use them for a certain period of time, give them a certain amount of pay, and the rest of the other pay goes to the master. So one therefore could argue that really slavery transited into what was known as contract labor, indentured labor, which was also very similar to slavery. But again, as Catherine has said, it differed from one region to another.
I can see some. Maybe Juan, Patrick, if you want to contribute as well. Patrick, yeah, please.
I think the problem here is the international definition of what slavery constitutes, which actually restricts what a slave is into total ownership. But those indentured terminology or indentured, those people, as Samuel has said, they signed things that they didn't understand, but the terms were the same. So it was, to me, a form of slavery, but it doesn't fit within the international definition of what slavery is. But it was deception into slavery, just that.
There's a couple of things.
Yes.
Sorry, yeah, I can add. It was definitely quite quickly we decided that our films shouldn't just stop at the golden stories of the abolitions, clearly. And that's why we decided to go all the way past the last abolitions in Brazil, all the way into indentured work, contract work, forced labor, and the beginning of the colonial occupation of Africa. Because to our minds, this is rarely done. The connection between those moments of history are often looked at, and look at what the colonial forces did when they came to Africa. They say, we come to liberate you from slavery. And I think this mindset has really, in the West, kept quite strongly to say, oh yeah, slavery was, and then colonialism is evil, but these are two separate things. And I think one of the things that we wanted to do was to connect, not necessarily that to say it's the same thing, but to connect those moments of history, to help, because back to the first question that was asked, to try to also understand better the world we're living in today. And it's quite surprising that we thought it was quite natural to do this progression of, and to link those periods. And a lot of people said, wow, you're touching here on something that, is rarely talked about, how one thing leads to another like this. And also one thing I could add, which is more from experience while filming in the Caribbean, filming in Guadeloupe, where there was a lot of engagé indentured workers as well. Today, if you speak to people today, they come from background of ancestors that were slaves and also from indentured workers. And these people are carrying the history of within the families of slavery and indentured work. So sometimes the I'm not quite sure what we gain by making a difference from it. But in the reality and in the culture of people today, these things can be also very mixed. I don't know what it's like in your part of the world, but definitely in the Caribbean or in the Réunion, for example, this is very strong.
Patrick, do you want to add something?
Yes.
I can see it.
I had a long discussion with my mother about this, and she knew somebody who was a recruiter, an agent, and they will deceive people and transport them and take them to the plantations, especially the sisal ones. And you are given a portion, and if you don't finish it, then it's written off. You have to finish. By the time they were through, they never finished 7 years. After the end of 7 years, they were so totally exhausted that they never lived for long. So the definition of slavery is very problematic, and I have a problem with that. I think maybe in the near future, we'll be able to look at the relook at it again and really say what slavery means to us from our point of the hemisphere.
Samuel, your micro.
Yeah, what I wanted to add on is that, and I would want to, Professor Iftikhar to, to look at it this way, is that the contract law was based on the English common law of contract. As there was a transition from slavery into contract labor, the law that was being used was the British law of contract, where the terms were that, you see, the person who is hiring and the one who is being hired must have an understanding. Both of them must have access to the contract, they must agree, and they must sign, and there must be a termination clause that if, for example, you do not agree with the contract, you are at liberty to terminate yourself from that contract. But unfortunately, during the early years of colonialism, and this was very common along the East African coast, many of the people were actually given these papers written in a language that they could not understand. And therefore, they were taken into slavery. And therefore, they were enslaved for quite a long period of time. Another issue why contract labor became very popular during the early years of colonialism, and this was a very contentious issue if you look at the Slavery Convention of 1926, is that the European nations actually were not willing to sign that unless, the definition of slavery was limited to total control. But then when you look at the contract labor, what we understand as indentured labor, there are very servile conditions. In fact, if you look at what was referred to in Mauritius and Madagascar as engage, where along the East African coast from Mozambique, the Yao people were brought to the coast, and therefore the people brought them to the coast. They met with the middlemen. The middlemen never understood the local language. The people who were supposed to go into contract labor never understood the French language. And therefore, it was exchanged between the middlemen that, they have agreed, they have understood the terms of this contract, and therefore they can go. And then many people went into enslavement for many years, in the French colonies in the Indian Ocean. And again, as I had said earlier, even the Indians also engaged in contract labor, hence enslaving very many people along the East African coast. And this is a subject that has not been discussed. Indians also played a very important role, particularly in the latest stages of enslavement. From about 1900 up to about 1926, there was a lot of Indians' involvement in slave trade. Even the construction of the Kenya-Uganda Railway, it was under what we know as indentured labor, contract labor. But many of these people were actually slaves who were taken from their masters under contract agreement to come and participate in the railway construction. And then the masters could be given some form of payment, and the slaves could also be given some form of payment. Even the Imperial British East African Company that was actually taking the quotas of the interior, okay, it used what we refer to as contract labor who were actually slaves. So really what one could say is that, there was a logical connection between colonialism and slavery. And if you look at the works of people like Benedetta Rossi, From Slavery to International Capitalism, that really explains, the logical connection from slavery to colonialism to international capitalism.
Okay, thank you very much, Samuel. The time is running, but I would like to ask, I think this will be the last question to Juan and Catherine, concerning the making of the documentary, because I know that you had to make crucial choices, and probably it was not so easy. So last week we had a very interesting question. One of our participants asked, was there a time when you were in an argument on what should be put on the documentary? So Catherine, I know that you were writing the book in the same time that the film was made. So, and Juan, you had also to make choice. So I would be happy to have both your reactions. So were you in an argument? Sometimes, Catherine.
Well, the idea to write a book was I felt as an historian and not at all as a cineast. And I was absolutely conscious that for a TV series, all the cineasts had to make choice, of course. And for example, speaking of medieval kingdoms of gold, which kingdom, Mali, Songhai, Zimbabwe, they had to take one and not 4 or 6 of them. It was too much. As an historian, I wanted to look at all that would have been possible for the film, but I have to say that I wrote the book while the cineast composed the film, and we did not correspond together during that time. The book was finished when the movie was finished, and I had to read again the text of the movie just to see that there were some historical mistake that was always possible for non-historians, but we did not correspond between and we had the same sources. We had the same sources. They were the specialists, but the specialists spoke. Each of the specialists spoke 2-3 hours, sometimes more, and everything was transcribed. And I had the whole of the transcription. That means some 3,000 pages. And each historian spoke for, I don't know, 1, 2, 3 minutes, sometimes 5 minutes maximum, and not 3 hours. Therefore, I had the whole documentation possible from these specialists. And this was my tool of work. That is why the book does not reflect the movie, and the movie does not reflect the book, but they are both on the same topic with quite different specialists.
Yeah. Yeah, it is very interesting, actually, the interaction between the consulting historian and the filmmaker. So what about the filmmaker?
Yeah.
Han?
Yeah, I mean, no, it was a real, I'm trying to choose my words. It was definitely an honor. It was also very interesting to collaborate with people like Catherine and also to meet the historians that I interviewed for the film. As from within, with Catherine, we never had an argument. I don't think I can remember one. We had some strong conversations, important conversations, but arguments, no. I think within the production team, no, it was quite a few of us that co-wrote and co-directed and produced this film. And we all come from different backgrounds. I spoke about that a little bit at the last meeting. I think that was one of the key ingredient of this project, was that it was a collective project, and with that we came into this history with different perspectives. And I think the success of our team was that we managed to kind of not just put all those two, but we questioned each other about, like Patrick said, this is a painful story. This is a human story, so we can't just approach it. I can't definitely approach it just as a neutral kind of point of view. I would say one thing, I don't know if we talked about it before, on the subject of reparation, there was quite different points of view within the team. I've, for myself, come from a quite Anglo-Saxon background because I lived in the UK and lived and worked for 20 years in the UK. And I'm quite comfortable with the subject of reparation. I mean, we could have another webinar about what reparation could be and should be. But the concept of reparation, for me, I'm comfortable with it. In France, this is a very sensitive subject. And within our mindset here, a lot of people feel quite not ready, or quite, it goes against our grain somehow, often. So on this, we had quite strong conversations, but they were always creative. And if you see, like, for example, in the end of the third film, we included this little moment from British television during it was a celebration of the abolition of slavery, where this activist came into Westminster Cathedral, protested. These we had to really work collectively on, should we include this or not, and stuff. So yeah, maybe this was the area where we didn't have arguments, but we really had to convince each other about the import, because dealing with history and the present at the same time, as you historians know, it's a complicated matter. And we have to be quite responsible of the links that we want to create, or how, when we put two things together, I think we have to be quite careful, but also quite responsible with our decisions. So on those points, we discussed again and again. Within the team, with the editor, we didn't talk about, but the editor of these 4 films was essential, because she was the one that kind of put the film on and then try again and then say, okay, well, what about this? Because like Catherine said, 4 hours, we had to make a huge amount of choices. 80% of the material is on the cutting room floor. We managed to incorporate the Eastern and the Indian Ocean, which is rarely done in the history of slave trade. Not enough. And coming to Kenya, like we did a few months ago to present the film there, was a real eye-opener, and saying like, yes, whole films should be made about this part of the world and what happened. But yeah, well, for filmmakers that might be listening to this, like go and fight for budgets and find ways to tell that story on a big level, on a small level, at community levels as well. And then keep arguing with the people that you're working with, because this is the best way that things are going to come through.
Yeah. I think we will have to end our session. I don't know if Samuel and Patrick, you want to add something on what was just said and conclude, maybe. Samuel, you might.
Okay, I wanted to say, and perhaps continue from where our colleague Juan has left. The subject of slavery and development in Western Europe and America came towards the end of the film. And perhaps this could have also been given more highlight because many people tend to argue that the underdevelopment of Africa resulted to the development of the European nations and the American nations. That the wealth that have contributed towards the development of Western Europe and America resulted from this process of subjugation. Perhaps that issue could have also come in more handy, but I do understand what Mr. Juan is talking about. Perhaps it would have raised the issues of liberation. The other subject I think that I saw was also underplayed is slavery at the margins of the empires. Little was talked about, the legacies of slavery, for example, in Africa. And I continue to insist, particularly the East African coast. What is the aftermath of slavery in this region? The way we understand it. There are issues of identity, issues of citizenship, issues of land, issues of lack of acceptance. You might be surprised that those, for example, who have an ancestry of slavery up to now, they suffer the stigma of slavery. And it's not necessarily, a social classificatory system. That hierarchy that is created because you were a descendant of a slave actually denies you access to many privileges and rights in society. And this is one of the major reasons why we have mass poverty along the East African coast, with very few people owning a lot of land. This is also a national issue, for example, in Somalia, that is going through the process of reconstruction now. And this is a subject that is less talked about, where you have what you refer to as the Bantu Somali who are not accepted as Somali nationals. They still carry with them that name of Bantu slaves who were taken to Somalia many centuries ago. So they are still considered as second-class citizens. Perhaps these are some of the issues that should be discussed when we are looking at the legacies of slavery, particularly from the point of extraction. Thank you very much.
Thank you too. Do you want to go? Patrick, are you with? We can't hear you. Yeah, thank you.
You would like me to wind up?
Yeah, I take advantage.
Yes, let me take advantage of that. First, I would like to thank Juan, Catherine, those people who worked on this documentary, because it's a big, big step forward. And maybe we should be looking into, should we have a second series of it, so that we can comprehensively look at the East African coast and those other areas that still have gaps. But this is a milestone, and I really congratulate you for this. And the forum has been very informative. I think there are those things about indenture, what is slavery, and all this. Those really needs to come into the thing, the contradictions about what slavery is and what it is not. And it's very, very important to talk about them and know that indenture to some of us could mean slavery, but in actual sense, according to the World Convention, it's not slavery. It's an agreement. Thank you very much for the engagement, and I really appreciate every moment of it. Thank you, Marie-Pierre, and Alliance Française, Sita, and her team.
Yeah, thank you very much, Patrick. Thank you very much, all our panelists. It was really a pleasure to share with you this adventure. And also Arcita, it was the first for most of us. So thank you very much for having accepted to contribute to this web seminar, and the Alliance Française to have welcomed us. And I want also to thank and acknowledge some of our attendees. We had with us Her Excellency Elisabeth Barbier. We have our Professor Georges Abongo, Dr. Marie-Aude Fouéré from the CFE, the IFRA, French Institute of Research of Africa. We have Salah Trabelsi, who was with us last week for the first web seminar. He's teaching history at the Université Lyon Lumière and who contributed to the documentary. We have Professor Amadou Seou, who is a historian working on the slave trade and the history of slavery in Cameroon, in Maroua University. He is one of us. We have also Okoko Ashikoye, our colleague from the National Museum of Kenya, and who is doing a lot to also disseminate the history of slavery and slave trade in East Africa. And all the, of course, our Professor Iftikhar Malik from BATPA, but we have already seen him. So I just want to thank you again. Just a message from Her Excellency Elisabeth Barbier. Hello from Kuwait, and thank you all for this very interesting session. I really thank you also, and it was wonderful to share all this event with you. So I wish you a very good evening, and I hope that we will have many other sessions like that together. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ah